Welcome to the Leadmore podcast. I'm your host, John T. Meyer. Now, the Leadmore podcast is the show where we sit down and talk with leaders of today to help inspire and create more leaders for tomorrow. Because I am convinced that the world needs more leaders and that you should be the next one. Leaders come in all shapes and sizes, and that's who we sit down and talk with. It may not always look the way you think leadership does, but we have incredible leaders, and that's who the people we're trying to talk to on the show. And episode 48 is no different. We sit down with Rob Walling. Rob is an entrepreneur. He is an investor. He's a podcaster. He runs events. He runs a blog, and he's been doing all of this for over a decade. He's an incredible resource and really a thought leader in the space of bootstrapped SaaS companies. And we unpack what that actually means and why it's so powerful for all entrepreneurs. But we look at how Rob helped create that category, and really as a thought leader, how do you become a thought leader, almost forced into a leadership role, one that he didn't really set out to do. He just was passionate about this and continued to talk about it. We talk about how you as a leader can explore bootstrap SaaS as a potential career opportunity and spotting future leaders within your organization. So a great discussion here with Rob. I love this conversation. You're going to like it too. So episode 48 here with Rob Walling. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Leadmore podcast. I'm here with my friend Rob Walling from Minneapolis. How are you, Rob?
Doing great, John. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, you bet. I'm excited. So thanks for being patient with me. We've been trying to kind of book this one for a while, and I did see you speak. You came to Sioux Falls a couple of years ago and spoke at the Innovation Expo. Tell us what you've had. A lot of titles, a lot of projects. What's the one you own or claim first right now?
Yeah, right now is a great way to put it because it changes over time, right? I mean, I think of myself first and foremost as like a maker. Like I make things. And I think if you were to push it and say, well, what's the corporate title? I like being founder and CEO, founder, because I like starting things, whether it's companies or back in the day, I was in bands, but started several different bands when I was a kid.
I did want to ask you about that record behind you, what that story there.
Yes, so that is an authentic gold record from the Beatles' Abbey Road, and it was presented to them when at one of the times it went gold, which is I think it's like 30 times platinum, which means it's 30 times gold. So there are 30 of those that exist, and then there's 4 members. So I believe if I were to do loose math, 120 in the world. Now, who knows how many exist still, right? The Beatles are you get these big bands, and they don't actually care about their goal. They don't care about the 500th gold record they've hit. So
how did you acquire this awesome collectible item?
I got it at an auction, and it's an online auction. Yeah, I collect things, and I used to collect small comics when I was a kid, and now that I've have a little more means after selling some companies, I like every once in a while getting a bigger piece like that. That's just something I can think about and look at every day and think like those guys spent like 20 years to get that good, and like I spent 20 years to have enough money to buy that. You know what I mean? It's like a sense of pride, right? Like I'm in a different place than when I was growing up, and my dad was an electrician and my mom stayed at home, and that feels good.
Yeah, I mean, they're the classic, 10,000 hours in, was it Manchester, right? Where they just kept grinding and working on Liverpool. Yep. Working on their music. So that's cool. That's the original, before the original NFT, right? A real item that nobody else can have.
That's right.
So in your founder, which do you talk first about, the fun, Tiny? Do you talk about, TinySeed. TinySeed. Do you go MicroConf? What do you kind of like to lead with when you say founder?
That is fascinating. It depends on who I'm talking to. So I focus on 3 things these days. After I used to run a software as a service company. I sold that in 2016. And these days I work on 3 things: a podcast that I've been doing for 11 years called Startups for the Rest of Us. Talks about bootstrapping SaaS. And then MicroConf, which is it's the oldest and the largest community for bootstrapped and mostly bootstrap SaaS founders.
Sure.
And then TinySeed, which is a fund for people who want to bootstrap SaaS. You're starting to see the theme. I think most often I lead with MicroConf just because I've been doing it the longest. TinySeed's only been around for about 2.5, 3 years. But obviously, if I was on a podcast about investment, then I would lead with that, and MicroConf is kind of the secondary.
Cool. So one of the things I want to start with is I have a as someone who is probably entrepreneurs often have shiny object syndrome, kind of a dabbler. I feel like I'm a little bit more of a generalist than a specialist. So I always have a lot of admiration for people who just continue to create and do things over and over and over and always show up. And so, you've had some success, like you said, in these last few years, but even before, you were podcasting for 11 years, that's 2010. So like, take me back to 2010 when you're trying to build a company, you're still running a podcast. What drove you to create all this stuff?
It was really, well, there were two different motivations, right? So in my career, I have made 10 times, 100 times more money from building software companies, growing, whether it's a profit from them or later selling them. But on the side, I always wanted to have some type of connection or community. And it didn't exist in 2005 when I started a blog. And I was like, I kind of want to bootstrap software, and you go back to those early posts and I'm just this lonely tree falling in the woods with no one else around me. And by the time I built up an audience, it was, it took me a few years, and maybe 2008, 2009, this was all a side project, right? The blog was a side project. Then I wrote a book that was really a side project while I was trying to run companies. And then the podcast was a side project, and MicroConf was a side project. It's not anymore. But so the companies during the day were my focus because I wanted to be ambitious, and I wanted to change my life, and I wanted to, build companies because it's interesting and fun to do. And all the other stuff that we talk about now was almost a hobby, because I wanted to be around other interesting founders doing interesting things. That was really what kept me going. Because
the prevailing theme, you said you were from California at the time, was, I'm sure especially there, raise money, raise a big fund, grow a huge company, scale it to the moon, right? Yep,
that's right. And that's a narrative. And it's, to be honest, it's probably now my mission in life is to just communicate to people that that's not the only narrative. I don't think that's a bad narrative. There are companies that you really cannot build without that. But I think about 99% of companies can and should be built without hardcore venture capital. I use the term bootstrapped and mostly bootstrapped because I know tons of whether it's small tech companies or small SaaS companies, that they do raise 100,000 to 300,000 in the early days. And maybe they raise a little more later, but that's very different than this venture track that we see with WeWork and Uber. And, that's where they raise hundreds of millions, if not more. And that shouldn't be, I was brainwashed. I mean, in 2005, I was like, the only way to start a software company is to take venture funding. And I just wish I had known different then. And that's kind of my, again, my mission is to let people know that's not the case.
Cool. And this is a great, maybe like if anyone's listening and long-term Leadmore listeners, like, okay, wait, is this about SaaS now? Or like, where are we going? Like, let's do a little level set, because we're going to get into why I think you're absolutely a leader. But just maybe give us a quick, like, for the audience, unpack the, why you think SaaS is so special, and then sort of the route of why a bootstrap, what that means, and how because one thing I want leaders to learn is that, like, there are a lot of ways. I like the way you said it. I wanted to change my life, right? There are a lot of ways to do that. If you're listening to this and you want to be a leader, you want to start a company, but you don't know where to go. So let's first start with SaaS.
Yeah. SaaS stands for software as a service. And it's really just any application it's a web application that you charge a subscription fee for. And so if anyone in your audience has used MailChimp, that's, in the old, if you go back 25 years to do what MailChimp does, you would have downloaded a desktop app, probably paid a one-time fee, and needed
like the CD-ROM. Yeah.
Totally. Right. Yeah. You download, or even before that, you buy a CD-ROM. We used to buy Microsoft Word, right, on a CD-ROM, or you downloaded it and you paid a one-time fee. QuickBooks, Quicken, all these things, they're now in the cloud, and they're up on a server. You go to QuickBooks.com or you go to Outlook.com and you log in and you pay a monthly fee, right, or an annual fee. That's SaaS. Those are big company SaaS. But the iceberg of SaaS is that there are tens of thousands of little SaaS companies. And by little, maybe, I had one that was making $250,000 a year, and I was the only employee, and I had about $3,000 a month in expenses, right? It was incredibly lucrative. It was a keyword tool for a search engine optimization. But that's little. Or you could say little is, a $5 million or $10 million company, because little by venture capital standards, or little by the rest of the world, it'll never be in Fortune magazine. It'll never get written up on TechCrunch. And yet that founder has changed their lives. And if they
Absolutely.
decide to sell it, these things can have 50% net margins, relative 30 to 50 pretty easily, even at scale. So you can do math on how much money they can make
and
if
then
money's
big
the goal.
multiples. Yeah.
Big multiples when you sell. And so that's really the value and the beauty of SaaS.
I think, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think SaaS seems to kind of get credit for this. So even if someone's listening and doesn't know software, doesn't want to do software, another part of the model that's so fascinating is that subscription, that recurring revenue model. And so you're seeing businesses take, traditionally, even agencies, right? Like instead of selling the big one-time huge website, maybe they sell it as a subscription and continual value and services. So you've seen a lot of different subscription companies. Talk about how the power of that, what's done for you as a founder.
Absolutely. I mean, the value of it, because I'm old enough that I was running couple software products, small ones, that before SaaS. And every month on the first of the month, I looked at my revenue and I had $0. And it was like, well, I got to go do some selling to get back up to last month. Well, with SaaS, every month, if I was at 10,000 last month, and it's presuming I don't have a bunch of people churning out, on the first of next month, I pretty much have 10,000 in revenue. So I only, I don't say you only go up, but really that's the thing. If you're doing it right, every month you're just adding 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, and it just comes in. Now it's not easy. We're making it sound easy. SaaS is this very long, slow ramp because in the old days, you'd charge $500 for a piece of software, and maybe you can only charge $30 a month or $50 a month. So as a result, you might need 10 times the customers to make the same amount of monthly, but then they just pay you until, kind of, it's not indefinite, but they pay you for a very long time, right? Until they churn.
Yeah, if you continue to add value. And
that's right. It's a flywheel that you build rather than this flywheel versus a hamster wheel is how I think about it.
Yeah, and I think you made the right point, which is, like the flip side, my business partner and I were two people. We paid South Dakota $150 to incorporate our company. It had 2 laptops. The first project we sold, we were in the black and off we go. SaaS you can build for 18 months. You can't find product market fit, and so, but when you hit that flywheel, yes, then you really have something special. So
that's right. Yep.
Well, let's go to then. So what I wanted to talk to you about leadership was this fascinating. So you're creating a podcast, you have a conference, you have a blog way back to, what was it, Blogger at first? What were you on?
Yeah, I was on WordPress, still
WordPress.
Yeah.
Okay. And you have a moment, I'm guessing at some point, where you realize, like, am I the flag bearer of this movement, of this bootstrapped SaaS? Like, there are other narratives, other ways to talk us through that. Like, when did you realize this is my life's mission?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it too, because I do think now life mission, legacy, that's a word that comes in. It feels grandiose, but I'm at that point where it's like, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? Because I did what I came here to do. Like when I was 20, I was in college and I was like, I want to start a company or multiple, and I want to have enough money at some point that I never have to work again. I will always work. I want to be able to work on whatever I want when I want, right? That was the goal.
The freedom.
Yep. And I achieved that about 5 years ago. And so now I'm like, okay, well, what's next? And what's next is exactly what you're talking about. It's like, what's my legacy? It took me way too long to figure this out because I started writing essays in 2005. I've written 3 books on essentially bootstrapping startups or being a founder, 550 podcast episodes, 20 in-person events. Yeah, all the things. I did this. And it wasn't until it was like 5 years ago. So it was, more than a decade in, where my wife sat me down. She's very smart, clinical psychologist. She's a founder, consultant and CEO consultant. And she said, you realize how many people look to you for not only for guidance, but like as an example, and they look for you to set the tone, and what you talk about on your show or what you tweet about or whatever, people then talk about for weeks. And you are now a leader. She didn't use that word, but in essence, that's what she was kind of like, I've realized this, have you? And I have a very, I'm an introvert, a software developer. Like, this is not, my life's mission was not to be the leader of some movement, to be honest. Yep. But here we are. And since then, I've really done a level set of like, I almost owe it. I think I owe it to the people. Like I get, I don't know, an email a week, maybe 2 to 4 emails a month that are like, you don't know me, but I listened to your podcast for years and it completely changed my life. And here's how, and I'm running a business now that's doing 50 grand. You know what I mean? And I get those. And I think first I was just like, is this even real? But now it's like, I feel like I almost owe it to people to continue doing this. And I enjoy it. That helps, right? I was doing it when it was, when I was making no money at any of this, right? When it was a hobby. But yeah, it's like a responsibility now, and not a burden, but a responsibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's two ways I want to go on that. So the first is you kept doing it even when it wasn't, say, either making you money or even maybe like filling your cup from you've changed my life. So what was, without realizing, what were you so passionate about the topic, or you had just felt so firsthand how it could change your life, or what kept you making those episodes in episodes 61 and 67? And
it is a good question. So there were a couple things. One is I knew that I needed to be around other like-minded people, or else I would just quit all of it. And like I needed a community. And so I kept pushing that forward because I got a lot of value out of the community itself. Whether I had built it or someone else had, I wanted to be part of it. And I wanted it to continue to exist. The other thing was very much the Jerry Seinfeld. I don't know if you ever heard how he said, I write a joke every day and I put an X on the calendar.
Don't break the chain, right?
Don't break the chain. So for me, if you actually look back, I blogged for about 5 or 6 years and then I stopped because writing is really hard. And I did break the chain and I didn't do it. And I write books really sporadically. The podcast though comes out every week, Tuesday morning. And we have not missed, an episode in about 10 and a half years. We used to go every other week for a while, but blah, blah, blah. Wow, but even now, like I'll get sick and I'm like, I got to record, I got to get something out, and that's a chain. And I just I can't let that die now after almost 550 episodes.
That's cool. I like that. And so then the other thing I wanted to ask you was this idea of sort of accepting that you now are a leader, but also in a different way than maybe when you were running a company, because these people don't work for you. You don't necessarily see them or know them. They don't report to you. They're not writing their paychecks. So talk about, this show's about leadership, leading people. You're almost leading like a persona of people without actually knowing or seeing the people. So talk about that. I mean, you do probably get to know them, but
that's what happens. So it is a persona or a few. There's the really early stage, and then there's the middle stage, and there's the growth, later stage people. What has helped is meeting them in person, and that was one reason we started running MicroConf, which is started as an in-person event, and it's now an online community and a whole bunch of YouTube channel and a whole bunch of other things. But in 2011, we had our first event, which was like 90 people in like a smoky Vegas ballroom and totally bootstrapped, almost lost a bunch of money on it. And meeting people there, it was like, oh, so this is who's listening and reading. Like it was this big realization. And that has actually really helped me, come to grips with the persona. When I write or when I speak on the podcast these days, I often am thinking about one individual or like a small group of people that I know. And that fills out the persona for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's different than like being an elected leader, right? Where people voted you in, or being a CEO where you hire these people. It's like you're leading a movement that people choose to follow, and whether you wanted to or not, you've become sort of a leader of that movement.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so for me, a leader of the movement, for me, it's a big part of it is then thinking about how do I steer people right? Like, how do I be, moral and ethical about, how do I be ethical about this and like give people the best information that I have to help them? And also, how do I keep providing value to them after this many years? And the fact, so I'm not an operator anymore, right? I don't run a SaaS company today, but I ran several of them and, sold the last one 5 years ago and worked there for another couple of years. But how do I continue to engage in a way? Because as you said, I'm not elected and I'm not their boss. So really they can stop listening to the podcast anytime, right? And they can stop following me on Twitter anytime if I'm not still bringing them relevant, up-to-date stuff. And so and of course I do that through people I know through MicroConf and my portfolio of investments. I have like 56 SaaS companies now or something I'm invested in. It's a lot. So. And
that's why I wanted to ask you then, did those other things, conference, fund, did those come out of need that you realized the community needed it, or you wanted to drive? Like, what was first?
Exactly that. Yep. It was always a need. And so we had a podcast and I had the blog, and it was, and at that point I had started an online training thing. It was like a forum plus education around, hey, here's how to bootstrap like a a small app to 10 grand a month. Like here's how to quit your day job. It's really what it was. It was like marketing for developers almost. And it was like, this is SEO stuff I know. Again, this is 11 years, it's 2009 to 2010. And got a few hundred founders in there, or developers and aspiring founders. And forums were pretty vibrant. It's like, these people are like, they're really interesting. And we started being like, does everyone want to meet in person? Like, would you come to Vegas if we charged $400 and like we all flew? And so that was it was that impetus of like, I believe like audio is, I read and write a lot, but I believe audio is better than like the written word personally. And I believe video is better than audio, even though I don't actually watch much video. And I believe in person is better than video, in terms of not better is not the right, but engagement, right? In terms of connection, all those metrics, right? And that was where it was like, take it to the next level. And then TinySeed, again, is only 2.5, 3 years old. And that definitely came out of a need in the community it's this community of bootstrappers, but bootstrapping or just starting any company, especially SaaS, is really, really hard in the early days. As you said, you can spend 18 months building. You can, it can take you a year or two to get to, or more to get to a place. And people didn't want to go the venture track. And so we were trying to figure out, is there an in-between where maybe you do just raise 100,000 or 200,000 and it just gets you
speed
to
up that timeline.
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of people were asking for that. And so it was like, okay, well, I guess to your point, it's like, I remember someone actually came up to me literally after a talk I gave and they said, you've done some angel investments. I think you should invest in a lot of bootstrappers. And I was like, yeah, that's a really good idea. And they're like, yeah, someone should like start a fund to invest in bootstrappers. I was like, yeah, someone should really do that. And I walked away. And the next day I was like, wait a minute, who should do that? Right. It should probably be me. So,
yeah. Well, and that's a great leader. We said that before, right? If not me, who, right? Yeah. Who's going to step up and do that? This thing needs to exist. And I imagine, in that angel model of taking lots of small bets, it's got to be a pretty good economic, there's a lot of opportunity too, right? Like we just talked about the beauty of what happens to SaaS if you can really break through escape velocity.
Yeah, that's right. And I have 16 investments that I made personally over the last 10 years, I believe, since 2011. And then the rest, like we're at 40, we'll be at 40 with TinySeed. And so the earliest ones have started to pay off basically with exits and, cutting. I'm now getting dividends. It's crazy. Like this is, again, I made like $4.50 an hour at my first job. Like I got out of college and I made $17 an hour, right? I went to public school my whole life. Like my dad was an electrician. I want to drive home here. I did not go to Harvard. I went to UC Davis and I worked my ass off. And so I'm now getting an almost monthly dividend of like $4,000 from one of the startups I invested in because they're an LLC. They don't want to exit and that's how they're going to pay out. And $4,000, you kidding me? Like I could have lived on that for, years. I'm in a different place now, but it's pretty incredible, the ability to be able to participate in that.
So one thing that's really popular today I wanted to ask you about is kind of community-led products, right? So people who start communities just like you did, and then kind of stumble into maybe the business or the product later, right? So they're looked to as a thought leader or a leader of so you kind of did this before it was like, popular.
That's cool.
But talk about that as far as like in the leadership vein, how somebody can create a following or a community and then spot opportunity, to help said community. Do you see that going on in your investments or in TinySeed deals?
So I don't, because it is the process of creating a community is just years and years and years of putting time in, usually with no like payback.
Yeah.
And at least in my experience, so there's like 4 or 5 communities that I really like, know, and respect. And it's like, we're the one for SaaS, and there's one for e-commerce, and there's one for buying and selling websites. There's one for digital nomads. And I know and they all did it the same way. They all had podcasts. Then they started in-person events. They did some writing, but it was 5 years before they made a single dollar of revenue. And so no one, the shortest path is to go find a problem that a business has and solve that problem and have them pay for it. So I don't see people building SaaS companies around it unless they kind of stumbled into the community thing,
Yeah. Okay.
And that's kind of where we did too. Like MicroConf, we kind of stumbled into it a little bit because we had the podcast community, and then kind of TinySeed was just, an extension of that. But I wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago, like, I'm going to start a fund for bootstrappers. I should start a community of bootstrappers in order to start that fund.
Okay. So let's talk about, you said, I'm an introvert. I didn't see myself as a leader. And I want to talk about sort of that transformation. Now, how do you think about leadership, having done multiple companies, employees? now also leading those who you're not employed by the fund. I'm sure you see a lot of different style of leaders with the investments you make.
Right. And I have to lead them. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's your kind of outlook on how you have to lead now that you've accepted that sort of title?
Yeah. That's a really good question, actually. And it was something, if you ask someone who's naturally amazing at something, they don't tend to know why and how they do it. I am not naturally amazing at this. So I have been very meticulous about do this. Yeah. Intentional is a good way to put it. I've realized that I don't need to know all the answers. And in fact, it makes me a better leader when sometimes I say, you know what? I just don't know. Never done that. And people since I do know enough, since I know 90% of the time, it's like the other 10%, it doesn't matter, right? So just saying I don't know is something. Growing up as an engineer and then a software developer, like I had a very hard time not always knowing the answer. So that's been a big thing. I think the other thing is there are so many types of leadership. Like they're the bombastic, charismatic, the loud, the big show.
Foreign ones,
Yep, they're the bad cop leaders, right? That are just like you respect them, but like they're always kind of saying the hard thing of like, I hate your pricing, it sucks. And then there may be good cop leaders, which is probably more of what I am, where I will say the exact same thing as my bad cop co-founder, Einar Volseth. We actually have in our Slack, bad cop is his head and good cop is me. And we will say the same exact thing, but we will say it in two different ways. He will come in and say like, I hate your churn. You need to fix it, right? And I'm like, okay, so in my experience,
is that a European thing? You think? I would have thought the other way around. I don't know.
It's just it's just personality. He just cuts to the chase. He's a sales guy, and he deals with private equity folks sometimes and investors. And I'm more like, well, hey, let's think about your churn this way, and here's what I would do to optimize. Like it's instantly, we'll say the same thing, but we say it in different ways. And so I think becoming authentic to me, because I was trying to lead like someone else for a while. Because I was like, oh, that person's a leader. I respect them. But it's like, but that's not who I am. And when I say their words, I sound not like Rob Walling,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I love that idea. That's been a theme on the show of sort of copy, edit, paste type of thing. Of finding the leaders that inspire you and adapting parts of it, but still being Rob Walling.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. And I think the other thing is there used to be either conversations, whether they were arguments, discussions online, relevant conversations of the day, that I would kind of opt out of and be like, I don't know, I don't really have any thoughts on that, or I don't know whether I have an opinion strong enough to blah, blah. And what I've realized, again, coming back to almost that sense of responsibility, is like, I do now as a leader feel like I maybe owe it to maybe the podcast listeners or maybe the TinySeed companies to, if something comes up, like when COVID started and lockdown happened, I could have just kept doing the podcast as is, but we did an entire episode of, this is COVID, we're locked down, this is how you should think about it as a founder. And part of that was like, cool, this is scary. I'm scared too, but we will make this through. Like I was almost reassuring, that the listeners and the audience, the community of like, we're going to make it through this. We're going to be okay. And I don't think 5 years ago, I would have felt like, well, that's a really weird thing to say, but it's like, no, people needed to hear that from someone, and someone who they know and trust. And so again, it does come back to that. It's not a burden, but I take it as a responsibility now to speak to things that I think are relevant, in the day and that people might need guidance on.
I love that. Yeah. You're right. We needed that a year ago at this time. So a lot of fear. And so whether it came from your podcast, a best friend, a loved one, like we all needed whatever source we got it from. Yeah. Okay. Let's see, 2 quick more, and then we'll wrap up. I want to know, do you think there's a certain type of leader that you either prefer or you think is more suitable for leading a bootstrap SaaS between whether the ones you've invested or known? I'm guessing you've seen all types. Is there an optimized one?
I'll say that I don't think there's an optimized type. I've seen a lot. I've seen like the super ambitious, like almost like aggressive, but not in a bad way, of just like, I want to do this and I'm going to crush it. And like, I'm going to do cold calls and I'm going to make it happen.
Bend the world at my will.
Yep.
Yeah.
And as long as that person treats other human beings well, and is ethical and respectful, I know a few founders I've invested in that have done really well. And then I have some that are super laid back and they're like, I just want to grow this great business and this is so cool and I want to improve the world, but I also want to, improve my life while I'm doing it. That's great. Again, as long as they're ethical and treat other people well. So the commonality I have, you can tell, is this point of like, I have also dealt with people. I've luckily not invested in people, but I've been around leaders that I'm like, you treat people like shit, you know, or you don't value other humans, and you're going to step on other people. The ends justify the means for you. And that's probably my biggest deal breaker, is like, if you don't value, you know, your relationships with other people.
Yeah. And as big as, you know, software has become, like, I would imagine that the SaaS world, especially the bootstrapped SaaS world, is actually pretty small, and people know each other. And if you are a person like that, bridges will be burned, and that'll, you know, karma will come back. But
that's right.
Okay, the last one, this is kind of a bonus question because it's not really the topic of this show, but I do think, and I'm in this space as someone who's in a kind of a year of transition and trying to decide what I want to do next. But let's talk about that spreadsheet story, because if someone's listening, and this podcast is not about coming up with business ideas. I know those podcasts exist, but if someone listened to this, because I think what's so cool about SaaS, especially Bootstrap, and then especially like what I've learned is that there's the most boring industries and most boring jobs are some of the craziest, most profitable businesses. Right. And so if someone's listening and they are in a job, talk about how do you come up with an idea for a SaaS company? And maybe I like that spreadsheet analogy because it's really tangible.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one example of that I always use is a company that is doing low 8 figures, so north of 10 million in revenue, as far as I know. And they are this tiny niche of construction, and it helps, like, you know, one trade on a construction site do like their design thing, and they own 80 or 90% of that market. And that's it. And it's 2 founders and like 6 employees, you know, and you can do maybe 10 employees, but it's just like, you do the math on that. It's insane. So there are niches everywhere. They are becoming more competitive for sure. But the analogy you brought up is the spreadsheet. Is anytime anyone at a business is using a spreadsheet to still do things, there is room for a SaaS app there to do that and to do it well. And whether it's to do that horizontally for everybody, or whether to just do it for people, you know, hair salons, or, you know, or, you know, electricians, or, you know, small home improvement contractors. Here's an example, like, go to tinyseed.com, scroll halfway down, and you will see right now there's 23 companies listed there. Just click through all their logos and look at the variety. You know, there's e-signature apps, which is like, oh, we all in podcast recording. Okay, that makes sense. And then it's like CRM software for home improvement contractors. And it's a database of M&A and funding deals for biopharma tech companies. Like, I would never have thought, but I'll just say these companies are doing quite well, you know, in that respect. So
that's great.
That gives an idea of it. But so to answer your question very succinctly, how do you come up with ideas? It's start with a problem, not with an idea. Start with a problem that a business has. Don't solve problems for consumers. We could do a whole podcast on that. But and I wouldn't say never. Yes, I wouldn't say never, but it's like, these are my loose guidelines. These are my 90-10s, right? Of like, try to focus on B2B.
To increase your chance of success.
That's what it is. Yep. And then find a problem that a business or a small business, whether it's small, medium, or large size business, has and are willing to pay for, and then find people who you can talk to help you, you know, build out the solution. Because oftentimes the solution is different than what you think. You think that lawyers need CRM software, where they don't really need that. They may need some other slice of it that you need to solve a different way.
That's great, Rob. Good advice. Okay, let's finish with a little rapid fire to get to know you. I don't know if you're a reader. I know you're a writer. You've written a couple books. What's a book you often recommend to people?
So my wife wrote a book called The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together. And I recommend it not be, and I'm listed as the co-author, but it's taken from content we put out on a podcast. And then I did
feet Rob Wallen.
I did 5% of it. And I make no money. She gives all the money for it, but it's very good. It's all about the mental game, which I think people really undervalue. I believe that the majority of being a successful entrepreneur is like figuring out your psychology and managing it through the ups and downs. So if you haven't checked that out, I recommend it.
Cool. How have you, 13 months in, I've been saying a year, but now we're even past that, in a pandemic. How have you stayed sane? I mean, you have 2 kids, how do you unplug?
I unplug by playing tabletop games. So, games with physical pieces. When we were playing before pandemic, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons in person. Nice. And I sit in front of a screen enough every day that while I love video games, I do not play them anymore. And so I have a big stack of games over here, Memoir 44, which simulates D-Day, and you roll dice and you move things and like that. I do it and the beauty is, of course, I do it with my kids, right? That's the thing.
And they like it too?
Yeah. If they didn't do it, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't spend the time, but it allows me to both engage my mind in a way that I don't during the day, and also be around, hang around with my kids.
That's awesome. Yeah. And it's there, I know you have kind of starting in the teenage kind of era. So that's probably hard to get them to sit down and focus and hang out with dad for a couple hours, right?
Not yet. The crossing fingers. I have almost 11 off, almost 15, and they're still very family oriented. So I know that'll change at some point, but still doing good there.
Well, maybe that's your answer to the next question. Then what's a piece of parenting advice you would give someone? Parents are leaders for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough because it's like without context, it's like what type, I believe different parents, they're just different types of parents, right? I think for us, we've tried to focus on a little bit on like growth mindset. Like if you haven't read this is the advice. It's going to be read the book Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. And there's fixed mindset, growth mindset. Ever since, and again, my wife coming from psychology, like this is a psychological book, but it's written for us, for lay people. And it's how to teach your kids not to think that the way things are today is the only way they will be. If they're not good at math, they're not good at math. It's like, no, you can be better at math. You just study. Yeah. Or you can be an entrepreneur. My son told me once, like, when I get older, I want to make a movie about Bone, which is a comic book character. He was 6 or something. And I said, no, not when you get older. Let's make a movie now. So we downloaded a stop motion app on the iPad. I said, never say when I get older, And then we made clay things and we did animation. And it's a 90-second movie. We still have it. We think it's hilarious because he and I voiced him, it's not a good movie, but he made a movie, So that's, I think, what we're trying to, encourage our kids to do.
Yeah, he'll remember that. I mean, he'll be telling his friends in college about that.
Absolutely.
Cool. I love that. Okay. What do you think your superpower is? The one thing you do better than anyone else makes you brag about yourself.
Yeah, I really do. My superpower is definitely not bragging about myself because it makes me feel uncomfortable. I think that I show up in the long term. You called it out on this, but like, I don't necessarily look out 10 years and say, I'm going to do this for 10 years. But when I start something, if it works, I am willing to put in the time. And I use this phrase for myself. It's relentless execution. And it doesn't mean that I don't take long vacations. It doesn't mean that I don't hang out with my family, but I relentlessly execute for months, years, or in this case, it's going to be decades. And I never thought it was a superpower. It's just hard work, and it's over the long term. But I do think that that's why I am where I am, is that I've done that.
I love that. Keep showing up. And then the last one, we touched on it briefly, this idea of leaders who have inspired you. So these could be people you know and love, or people you've studied. Who are the leaders who have shaped who you are, Rob?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's a lot. I mean, I think I like I was really inspired by Warren Buffett's biography. Just that, again, talk about long-term thinking. He just showed up. He did what he was good at. He's humble. Like, I'm inspired by people who have humility and they let their work speak for themselves. Instead of tooting their own horn and saying, "Look how great I am." I think Warren Buffett's a good example of that. Not that we're not going to model Warren Buffett's investment returns or anything about that, but there are other elements of this you can admire. I'm trying to think of someone else.
Recently, to give you a second, is I think 81 out of his $84 billion. This is in Morgan Housel's new book, Psychology of Money. He earned after the age of 65, right? So like, he's got 84 billion, and 81 of them came in the last, I think he's 20 years, which is just talk about just continually just showing up. But the flip side too is he started investing at like 13 years old. So like time, right? They always say time is compound interest.
It's the last few doubles, they say, right? Because your money doubles every 8 years depending on interest rate, right? But it's the last few doubles that are the big ones. Because when you're doubling and it's $100, it's not much. But once you have $1 million in there, that double and then that next double gets you to 4, right? Those are the big ones. I did think of someone else, and it was a man named Gene Revisa who honestly reminds me a little bit of Warren Buffett, but he ran an electrical contractor that my dad worked for 42 years. And I actually worked there a couple years out of college as an electrician. And he is he was a man he was charismatic. He was a leader, but he was very humble, and he was self-made, and he cared about people, and I think that's a lot of like, if I've said anything on this podcast today, it's probably try to be those 5 things. And I think I learned it from this man who I probably met when I was 10, and he passed away a couple years ago. But I worked directly with him for about a year of that time, and it was really impactful on me.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a huge part of the show is like, the only way you can lead is really by like learning to lead is by leading. But we do have these moments and these memories and these people that we sort of download into our head and copy their ways. And so even at 10 years old, it sounds like he made an impression.
Yeah, big time.
Cool. Well, this was great, Rob. Thank you for the time and for sharing your story. If people want to get a hold of you, whether it be checking out your podcast or what's the way you recommend that?
Yeah, Startups for the Rest of Us is the podcast, and you can find that in any place where greater podcasts are sold. You can reach out also to me on Twitter at Rob Walling.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Rob. You be well.
Absolutely. You too.
And that was episode 48 with Rob Walling. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of the Leadmore podcast. Reminder, we drop new episodes every Thursday. Every Thursday, you can find them wherever you subscribe to your podcast. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher. Just hit that subscribe button. Leave us a review, comments, feedback, who you'd like to hear on a future episode of the Leadmore podcast. And thanks for listening. Take care and be well.